and we are going to get started this morning. I first just wanted to start by talking about the objective of today and our panel discussion. We're going to be talking about resiliency and people that keep their cool in the face of adversity. And it's the ability to cope with setbacks and problems. And instead of hiding from those problems with unhealthy coping strategies and falling into despair, resilient people who choose to face life's difficulties head on. So I would be a little remiss to not talk about today's date. Being September 11th, it resonates, that resiliency, just with that date, because I was in Manhattan. I was in the Marriott downtown of Manhattan, and I was in a training session. And on that fateful day when, the world kind of turned upside down, we all bonded together, and I walked through those streets with folks. The only person I could get in touch with from the hotel was my mother on a 1-800 number, who told me that I was probably not going to see my husband for a little, who was a resident at one of the hospitals there in Manhattan, because they were going to be digging bodies out of the rubble. And I walked through the streets not knowing if I would see my husband, what was going to be going on, and I had just moved to Manhattan. So as you can imagine, just all of the anxieties, the anguish, everything, all of the emotions, and I'm sure each one of you on the phone has your own set of circumstances from that day. You can remember where you were and how you felt and the people who were around you. My husband wound up being on the night shift. He was not down there, and as we know, there was no bodies that were pulled from the rubble. But it was really the aftermath and the experiences that I think were life-changing for me. Ironically, I had an interview the next day, September 12th, to change industries and to move into banking in a job I really had no experience for. And obviously, my interview was canceled, and they hired me without that final interview to move it into a small business relationship manager position in banking. I look back on that now 19 years ago, and I'm not sure if I would have had that job if the circumstances would have been different. I wasn't necessarily qualified, and it was the set of circumstances, and I was never going to let anybody see me sweat. I was new in an area of Manhattan. I was with my fiance, soon-to-be husband, in a new job, in a new industry, and there was resiliency, and there was grit, and it was all of those events that added to who I am today, to show the types of things that we can build on and grow from. And I'm joined by some amazing panelists today that are going to share their stories, and they're going to share what resilience means to them. So I would like to start, I'm going to first introduce Michelle Bajwa, who's the co-founder of Domain Computer Services. We also have Osada Chitu, who is with the founder and principal consultant of Comply by Osada. I have Tanisha Laird on with me today, who's the CEO of the Newark Symphony Hall. And they each have their own stories as well. So first, I'd like to turn it over to Michelle. And Michelle, I'd love to hear how you are dealing with traumatic events. What are some of your strategies to get through and deal? And how are you resilient? Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I join you in honoring the memory of everyone we lost and was affected by the 9/11 tragedy. Trauma is at the forefront of my mind, especially today. And as I look back on it, I've been sort of reflecting on how we got through that time. And I realized we practiced a balance of being mindful and empathetic and gritty. And in the sense that, and I loved when you said gritty, Rachel, just because I find that those who are resilient don't get stuck in a cycle of shoulda, coulda, wouldas, right? You know, it's like that constant thing that people do with rumination, like, oh, I should have done that, and I should have done this. And it turns out to be just more of a procrastination method. So when I find myself pulling myself up by the bootstraps, it's really just a mix of, okay, understanding my situation, being mindful of all the players in that situation, not just me, not just living in my own head, because then that actually will sort of suffocate my ability to take action. So on 9/11, that happened too, where both of my parents worked in New York City, and my father was downtown right near the World Trade Center, and he actually saw them crashing down. It was something else. Thankfully, he, was at a meeting, and it's funny how life works with that, and the universe puts people in different places. And with life in general, I really gain strength from hearing other people's stories of resiliency, because it actually makes me feel less isolated. I find that those who get stuck in a cycle of just being frozen and not being able to take action tend to live in their own heads, in their own worlds, and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm the only one going through this and I have no idea what to do. They just become frozen. So that's sort of, for me, resiliency is more of a mindset than specific examples. I take each moment as I can, I acknowledge those feelings, and I think, okay, now what can I do to move forward? So that's sort of how I take it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Michelle. And I can resonate too. My father was NYPD down, saw the buildings come down, and my mother-in-law was a teacher. So once you start thinking about all of those, other people and the impacts and the resiliency for each of them, and the grit and what defines you and helps you to move forward, you can't, pull the covers over your head, but you have to get up and sometimes plow through even in the hardest of conditions. So thank you for that. I'm going to now jump over to Asada. Asada, please share with us, how do you deal with, adversity, and what does resilience look like for you?
Sure. I mean, having, resiliency is really a personal journey, right? Because everyone deals with issues differently. And I would say prior to what I would consider my internal trauma in adulthood, right? So, there was a prescribed road I was supposed to follow, and I followed it, right? I'm Nigerian. I married a fellow Nigerian. I got my law degree because, Nigerian, you can only be a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, or disgrace to the family. It's just, those are your choices. So did that, had my kid, moved into a nice neighborhood, and then my life kind of fell apart. My husband chose to do other things, and then all of a sudden, I'm an unmarried Nigerian single mama. That's just not in the cards. It wasn't supposed to be in the cards for me. So I could have stayed stuck, right? I could have stayed stuck, but I chose instead, and my training, I'm an attorney by training, so there's all those other things coupled with that. You work like a donkey, right? And I'm also a Black woman. You work like a donkey. We're taught not to have self-care. We're taught not to be kind to ourselves. We're taught to be kind to others, but we are last, if ever. And so I was able to develop that resiliency really through therapy, and recognizing that was important to have loving kindness for me. So if you ask my daughter now, who does mommy love the most? She says, mommy. Because if that was not the case, I would not be able to be resilient. So I would say my resiliency was developed through nurturing me. And so as I have faced sort of shakeups in my personal life, in my career, I've been able to do it. That ain't nothing. I done been through it, and been able to flex in certain situations. And I've received so much abundance once I showcased my own loving kindness to me. And so that has been really, really eye-opening, and has been the most critical tool in my toolbox, in being able to move forward from adverse events, right? Because those adverse events that's life, right? That is life. That's literally what life is. And so that common saying is, it's not what happens to you, it's how you react to what happens to you, right? That's really what the distinction, as things are going to continuously happen. Look at coronavirus. I know none of us expected to be here trying to like navigate this telephone and all of this. No, that was not in the cards for 2020 at all. So what do you do about it, right? Do you stay stuck? Because it's really easy to stay stuck, but do we use this opportunity to grow and to learn and maybe flex in a different way, maybe engage in different opportunities that we didn't think were possible before, but also during that whole time showing yourself loving kindness. That's just and when I try to explain that to people, sometimes they don't get it, right? Because to me, it's really that simple. Once you take that step, so many other doors open, and you're able to move forward from those adverse situations, which we're going to continue to face throughout our entire lives.
Yeah. I love a couple of things I just jotted down. I mean, one, I love you talking about therapy, because I think that that is something that some may consider taboo. So for you to call that out and say that that has helped you, I think that was a very powerful statement. So thank you for sharing that. I love that statement, who does mommy love? Because that's pretty powerful too, that if we can't remember to love ourselves, how do we press forward and be good for everyone else? So that was powerful. And the last thing is, how do you prepare for that unexpected? Because just like you said, nobody expected for COVID, and it's not, you know, it's how do you react? How do you move forward? And how do you advance, even if it feels like there's no way to progress? So some pretty powerful stuff there. Thank you for sharing that with us. Next, I'd love to go over to Tanisha. If you could please share with me, what does resilience mean to you, and how have you been able to identify that within your life?
First of all, thank you. I also want to acknowledge this day in particular as part of the journey, which Asada talked about. We all have different journeys. My husband's assistant, Clarabelle Hernandez, is one of the people who we lost during 9/11. She had switched jobs. It was like her working girl, if my generation know what that means, that movie moment. And unfortunately, she passed away. And so I just want to acknowledge, 19 years later, that, I have not forgotten her. So my series of traumas, as I was inventorying them, I realized they actually started a long time ago, about 27 years, nearly 27 years ago, a few months after marrying. My husband and I woke up to a big boom in Edison, New Jersey, and it turned out it was an interstate gas pipeline explosion, and we literally ran for our lives. There was a rolling ball, sort of like a movie, that was coming up, and our building was essentially incinerated in under 10 minutes. And again, we were fairly newlyweds. We had been married, I guess, about 5 months. If you ever can uncover the old early reality show, When Disaster Strikes Two, we were on that. And so that was a series of things that it's like, wow, I was very young. I met my husband in college. He wasn't in college. I was still in college. So I got married very young. And the first thing I did was call my mother. It sounds crazy. I'm like, I want to come home, So this idea, because I looked up the definition of resilience, and it said the ability to recover quickly. And I actually have object to that a little bit, because I do think you might need that time to pull the covers over your head, right? So again, and then 9/11, as I said, I have my own story with my husband and the worry, and worrying, of course, about Clarabelle and her brother-in-law, actually, who also perished, who worked at Windows on the World. But we got through those, right? I was raised by a single mother in New York, and 13 years ago, got a call in the middle of the night that, I had to come home or back to New York because, she was dying in the hospital. And when I got there, she, essentially was gone, and I collapsed. 6 years to the day after that, 7 years ago, my husband died suddenly. And it was, again, none of these things were things that you can actually prepare for, right? And so I was never the primary breadwinner. I mean, I worked, I worked, I have a good resume, but I was never the primary breadwinner. And here I am with a little girl who was 2 or 3 weeks away from turning age 3, and a 6.5-year-old. And suddenly I'm a single mother, right? And having to be the primary breadwinner. And so, it's okay. Then there's one more. I almost forgot, like the big one. Then last year on my now 14-year-old's birthday, she turned 13, and we were in Maine, and I get a call from my doctor that the biopsy that I had taken was positive, and so I have breast cancer. And so these are the series of things that only when I actually inventory them, the fact that I'm still standing here, I did have those moments where I pulled the covers over my head. I really did not move for about 6 months after my husband passed away. I was devastated. We were going to be celebrating 20 years of marriage that year. And I was planning a big celebration, and this is the love of my life. And so here, and we had finished building a beautiful home. And so it was one of those things where you do have to pick yourself up, though, right? I have my kids, I have my daughters. One thing that I think is unfortunate is that we are, as women, told that we need to do and be all the things, right? And so I hid a lot of this. I sat in my car crying, like, oh my gosh, how do I do this? I had to, frankly speaking, I never had to worry about how much I made because my husband made a significant amount of money. But we had started a new business in New York City and put all of our money in that business. And frankly, my husband did not plan for his death. So there was a lot of, how do I figure this out? So there's the second part of the definition. So I have a little issues with that first part about it having to be quickly. I think if you do it at all, you're resilient. The second part of that definition is toughness. And that's what I do think I have. I might not always bounce back as quick as I personally would like. It might not be within the few hours. I have to have that cry. I'm a crier. I cry at commercials. I cry happy. I cry sad. Seriously, there was a closet commercial the other day that made me cry. But I do get those moments in, and I also do think it's important that now, and having had that intervention of therapy, I do know now that it is okay for my daughters to see me vulnerable and to see me not be able to, get right back up and have those moments to collect myself so that they don't necessarily grow up to think that they have to be and do all the things all the time without intervention. So I do believe in intervention. And in this case, I'm talking about mental health. And I'll say one more thing, because I know I've been going a long time. It's only recently that I realized that. So when my husband passed away, I immediately put my children in something called Good Grief, which is for aggrieved children. It's essentially like children's therapy through play. Unfortunately, we had a lot of kids who lost parents during 9/11, for instance. And so they were getting all of these tools to be resilient. But I forgot that whole idea that, when you're on the plane and they give you those directions and, they tell you to put the mask on first, right? And then attend to your dependents. And so now when I think about my own self-care, which is still a work in progress, I think of it as I'm putting the mask on first, right? So that I can attend to my dependents. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. So some common things here: self-care, thinking about yourself first, and put your mask on first. There's nothing more visual around that. But I think you make such an important point that it's okay to put the covers over your head for a little bit. And sometimes you have to have that grieving process, because if you don't allow yourself time to process it, then how do you move forward? And allowing that space and giving yourself that allowance to do it, I think that's a really important point. So, and I'm a crier too. I wrote that down. I see a commercial with a dog or something, or that's it. I'm an emotional. I can resonate with that one. So, well, let's now switch gears a bit, and we're going to talk now. If you turn the news on, it's very obvious to see that there's a lot going on within society between COVID and Black Lives Matter. There are so many things that could impact us. And as a manager here at TD, I really have to do some check-ins with my teams, because sometimes you don't even realize what is going on in somebody else's house and who has been impacted and how have they been impacted. And I'll start off by just talking about the COVID pandemic and what it meant for me. I had been in a sales role my entire life. I have been customer facing and always dealing one-on-one with that client. December 1st of last year, I moved into my new role as the head of communications here. Well, moving in at a bank into a communications and training role 3 months later to roll into a pandemic, as you can imagine, I did not have any idea what I was walking into. But to some extent, I feel very grateful, because I could really come from a customer perspective and had dealt with customers for so long that I could understand how did we need to communicate to our employees so that then they could turn around and communicate to our customers. I was poised to be in a position that I was freaking out. I mean, we literally stood up 53 training sessions to help train for the Paycheck Protection Program. We stood up a virtual website to be able to give content and training materials. Our website had about 27,000 hits on it internally over the course of about 6 weeks. We had videos that we were creating. We were having, just insane amounts of work. I was up at 4:30 in the morning. I was going to sleep at, I don't even know what time I was going to sleep, but I was working. But I loved it, because I actually knew the impact that I was having on the community, the people around me. I recognized the position that I was in, and that we were working in a time that was bigger than us. I felt like I was a part of something that I could have an impact on a grander scale, and that people needed us and we were helping them. And, at some point at 4:30, staring at the screen to know what you have in front of you, it could be easy to say, like, I cry uncle. I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't been trained. I'm a salesperson. I don't know, and you have to figure it out. And to go back to what Michelle talked about, to have that grit and to know, like, I got to pull this forward on my desk. I can't push it over, because if I push it over, it's still going to be there in that corner today, tomorrow, and the next day. So let's pull that and figure it out and move in, heads forward. So COVID was, it was an interesting time. I had 2 boys. I wasn't sure some days if those boys ate or not. And I would do a check-in and say, is everybody okay? Everybody alive? And, we'd have to circle back, but we were all here for each other. I think like September 11th, I think this time will be one that we look back on and we remember how we all acted and reacted together. We're going to remember who were the people that surrounded you and stood up with you. And it will be a time that we will think back, like, when the air shuttle exploded, we know where we were. When September 11th, we know where we were. When COVID hit and we were all quarantined, we're going to remember that. And we're going to remember how we reacted and how we pushed through. And so for me, it was a crazy wild ride. And I don't think we're out of it yet, but we're figuring out together. So I'd love to, I'm going to come back the other way. I'll go in the opposite direction. So Tanisha, I'll start off with you. Can you share how you adapted to some of the things that are going on in today's climate? How do you get through? How are you showing your resiliency?
Yeah, so there were mechanisms, right? One of the things that I did is I'm going to start personally, and then what we did at Newark Symphony Hall. So personally, I answered the call of a former board colleague of mine on a nonprofit board. She's the director of a degree program, and she called me saying, "We're moving virtual. The adjunct doesn't want to move to that virtual. Will you teach this class?" And I said, okay, so when's the class start? And she said, oh, well, the new term starts on Monday. And she called me on Friday. And so I ended up teaching a class. And I mentioned that because that actually was restorative for me. Every Friday, I was teaching these eager undergraduates strategic management, and it became a way that I could end my week feeling like I contributed to something, right? You know, we had these young people who were also going through something very traumatic. My children had to move to virtual learning, and my youngest didn't really thrive. She's now 10. And so then we had to get the school psychologist she literally wasn't showing up for virtual school, you know, she was pretending she was showing up, but she wasn't. And so we then got her into speaking to the school psychologist once a week, and that intervention, you know, it kind of pulled her out, but she wasn't thriving. At work, we had two staff members of my administrative staff. My administrative staff is actually very small. We have about 150 employees, but since we're a performing arts center, the administration is only about a dozen, and two of them lost 6 family members between them very early in the pandemic. And again, the governor had issued an executive order that shut us down. And so I found myself, because I don't live close to the venue, I live 50 minutes away, just sort of reacting to what was happening in the city of Newark and helping to facilitate food. And also we found out that we had, because of 9/11 and the response to 9/11, we were an emergency triage location. So we discovered that we had pallets and pallets of personal protective equipment in our storage, including 9,000 N95 masks when everybody else was out of them. So in April, we were providing them. And so we created something that we called Embrace Newark, you know, hashtag, because everything has a hashtag Embrace Newark. And the idea is that it was an artist activated wellness and recovery initiative. We also did a nationally publicized a fundraiser for the our frontline community. It was a deaf poetry reunion. And because we had Jill Scott, who was just coming off this big battle with Erykah Badu in these versus internet battles, we got crazy national attention to the city. And the idea was, this is for Newark. So in addition, because it was very important that we bring the artists into this, we also created something that is now called Symphony of Survival, where essentially I paid 10 artists to contribute to an archive that was really documenting their self-isolation experience and then their experience during the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we now have 14 images of that on our building, on our 95-year-old building, because we opened on September 8th, 1925, that has Black Lives Matter. It has a poem, Don't Let Me Die on Front Street, and handcuffs, like really powerful things. Internally, though, because again, this is all the outside things that we were doing very early in the process, because I considered the staff, we needed to put that mask on. I just happened to say, because we started to do our staff meetings through Zoom, and there was this devastation that was happening and the death. We also lost, to our knowledge, at least 2 former staff members as well to the pandemic. And I said, would it be helpful if we brought a therapist into the next set? And everybody, before I could even finish, said yes. And so a therapist came in to the next staff meeting. I think he was only supposed to be there for like a half an hour, and he ended up, you know, working with the staff for more than an hour. And I also procured for them an app that is sort of like Calm. It's called Wisdom at Work, though. I should give them a shout out because they did sponsor and support us early, where the staff could respond to that as well. So those are all of the things that we did, that I personally did, and that we did collectively as the staff. And I just want to, again, I think some of them are probably watching, give them the shout out. We gave out over 3,000 meals as part of this Embrace Newark initiative. Right up until last week, we were still giving out breakfast and lunch daily in front of our building. And I think it was an important thing for us to do as an anchor institution in Newark. So thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you. I think the heroic efforts, again, those are the things that you're going to remember. You see them, and we we band together, and it's pretty powerful. So to give a little warning, we have about 10 minutes left. We are going to be able to hard stop at 11:45. I just want to remind, if anybody does want to type in a question or send something through the chat, we will hopefully maybe have a couple of minutes at the end. So I think now we'll go over to our next panelist. Asada, why don't you share with us your story, what's going on that you've had to be resilient?
Yeah, well, clearly this time period has really forced folks to think about this concept of resiliency. And so this space that I work in, so I do healthcare compliance, and so you can, and prior to coronavirus, from the compliance perspective, people don't care about compliance until it's an issue for them. You know, somebody's looking at them for some money because they were not compliant. That's when they care about compliance. But coronavirus has really, and I mentioned it before, provided a space for me to sort of flex in a different way in terms of the services that I provide. So that's been interesting from the perspective of the value that I bring and how I want to shape myself professionally. But I think I want to spend a little bit more time on how the Black Lives Matter movement and the vocalization of that has really impacted this, for me, this concept of resiliency and what it's forced me to change and evaluate. You know, to put it quite bluntly, it just created a space that I didn't have to be silent anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, because I have walked in this space of having to sort of dumb myself down, not offend, be the good Black girl, you know, particularly when I'm in spaces when I know, and not to be cocky, I'm smarter than everybody in the room. So I've had to navigate the world like that. And internally, that creates a lot of rage, right? However, we're not allowed to express that. And so the sort of social unrest that has occurred over the last couple of months that have been there all this time, it's just been bubbling underneath the surface. People just started listening because they had to listen because they were home with coronavirus or quarantining. It provided an opportunity for me to now say, you know what, this is nothing new, and I'm no longer going to be apologetic. Because prior conversations I had to preface, you know, really you should, it's not a calm conversation anymore. Well, it's always calm because that's just how I am, but I'd say it's not a comfortable conversation anymore. I make people very uncomfortable, and I feel it's just been so freeing, and it's led to a level of authenticity that we no longer have to have surface conversations. And so that has, and that's been of particular importance to me just because of the circles that I'm in. I often tend to be the one person of color, and then coupled with being a woman, coupled with being an African woman, you know, with, you know, multiple graduate degrees, it creates very unsettling spaces for non-people of color, particularly white men. And so it's just been so fabulous, must I say, to be truthful and honest, and that people are willing to also have those conversations. And so I think back to, what if I was having these conversations before? Mm-hmm. Where would I be? And so I am thankful for this time that people have had to reflect, right? Because I don't think people would be willing to have these uncomfortable conversations was it not for coronavirus and they were forced to watch certain things. So it has done a great deal for the ability for me to be authentic, and that's been great.
Well, I can say that the universe is lucky to have you. And so if, you know, if it feels like people push you forward to be the voice, that's because you have a voice to be heard. So, you know, you have a lot of things, smart, strength, and, you know, a voice. So that's powerful stuff. So Michelle, how about you? What are the types of things that you've had to go through in these recent either economic or pandemic? What's resonated with you?
Well, first of all, I have to just acknowledge and thank both Tanisha and Asada for sharing their experiences. My heart is pounding. Like, I am so grateful to have listened to these stories, and that in itself makes me much more resilient, because I'm going to remember you anytime I face adversity, and draw like a lot of inspiration from that. So thank you. So for us, we're in the business of securing IT for all sorts of businesses, small to medium-sized businesses all over the tri-state area. So we have the benefit of coming in and out of offices, and experiencing all different types of cultures. And what I've noticed is that the businesses that have thrived are the ones that were able to pivot quickly during COVID and look around and say, okay, these are the set of complications we have, and how can we adjust and adapt and innovate our services, the way that we interact with our staff. Those are the companies that I've seen do the best. And as we have as well at Domain, we've sort of pivoted and changed how we deliver our service to empower people who are at home just like all of us, connecting in through go to meetings and Zooms and things like that. In terms of mental health space, absolutely. I find that a lot of our employees, including myself, have been overwhelmed, having to take, it just seems like multiple traumas in all the time. We have environmental trauma, we have BLM, and the fact that a lot of people have been sort of stuck in a very rigid mindset, and that rigidity has not allowed them to be resilient. They don't give themselves the space to change, because they're like, okay, I've defined myself in this way, and if I look around and say, well, that person's defined differently, that means I've lost my ground, which is completely incorrect. I find that this BLM movement has been a revolution. I think it's been completely, it's opened our eyes, my eyes specifically as a minority, to how our struggles may be parallel but not exactly the same. And you have to respect that and acknowledge that. And that way you can move forward, just like very similar to when we see an issue, we sort of try to figure out what are the issues and be specific about it. Your struggles as Black women is different than my struggle as an Asian American woman. And I don't think there's anything wrong in saying that. I think that we have to acknowledge those differences in order to move forward. So I find that there's a lot of authenticity, as you said, Osada, if that comes from that, in that you can feel some grace in that acknowledgement and just being open to reconciliation. So I kind of went from, this is how we pivot from running a business to how we can learn from the BLM. But it's a crazy time. And I think that if we just sort of, like I said initially, resilience to me is a mindset. If we all just give ourselves some space to change and allow others to change around us, I think that we will all be in a better place for it. So thanks.
Great.
I don't want to take up all the time. We got 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think there was this one question that came in, and of course now it's left my panel. It was about the song, Tanisha, that you mentioned. Is there a way that people could find that? I think that was the question. I thought.
Don't Let Me Die on Front Street in Handcuffs. Where did that?
Yeah, so you can see it in person on our building, but you can in Newark, but you can also look at it online. If you go to symphonyofsurvival.com, you will see the archive of all of the creativity that was generated from our Embrace Newark initiative. It's visual art, video, paintings, and poetry. And so you'll see that poetry and essays as well. And thank you for the question.
Yeah. Well, I think that just about wraps up our time. I think we all are inspired by each other. I think we can all identify to some extent and to grow from some of the things that we've heard from each other. I appreciate the Women's Business Leaders Forum allowing us the opportunity to be here today. And for all of you on the line, thank you for joining. And so with that, we will sign off, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend, and we will get through all of this together. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.